I didn't find out our savings were gone through a bank alert or a late notice in the mail. I found out the night my spouse looked me straight in the eyes and said, "This is your fault." That sentence landed heavier than the truth itself. For years, we had built what I thought was a careful, responsible life. No luxury cars, no flashy vacations, just steady work, shared plans, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're doing things the right way. We weren't rich, but we were secure. Or at least, that's what I believed. I'm Daniel Brooks. I was 46 at the time. I worked in operations management for a regional logistics company. Long hours, predictable stress, decent pay. I wasn't a risk taker by nature. If anything, my weakness was trust. When I committed to something or someone, I stayed loyal, sometimes longer than I should have. My spouse, Laura, handled most of our finances. Not because I was careless, but because she was organized, confident, and always insisted she had everything under control. I reviewed statements now and then, but I never felt the need to hover. We've been married almost 2 decades. Trust felt earned. Our days followed a familiar rhythm. Early mornings, coffee at the kitchen counter, a quick exchange about schedules before heading out the door. Evenings were quiet, dinner, light conversation, maybe a show we half-watched while scrolling our phones. It wasn't exciting, but it was stable. The kind of life many people work their whole lives to protect. Looking back, the tension didn't arrive loudly. It crept in through small changes. Laura became guarded when money came up. Conversations ended faster than usual. Questions were met with irritation instead of answers. I told myself it was stress. Work pressure. Everyone goes through phases. The moment everything shifted came on an ordinary Tuesday. I had stopped by the bank during lunch to update a beneficiary form tied to one of our savings accounts. The teller typed for a few seconds, paused, then looked up at me with a polite but confused expression. "That account was closed," she said. I laughed, assuming it was a misunderstanding. Maybe a clerical error. Maybe an outdated screen. She turned the monitor slightly toward me and pointed. "Zero balance. Closed months ago." I drove home in silence, my thoughts racing but refusing to settle. I didn't accuse Laura when I walked through the door that night. I didn't raise my voice. I just asked a simple question. "Do we move the savings somewhere else?" She froze, just for a second, long enough for me to notice. What followed wasn't an explanation. It was deflection, then frustration, then blame. She told me the money had been invested, that markets were unpredictable, that if I had been more involved, more supportive, things might have turned out differently. By the end of the conversation, somehow, I was the irresponsible one. I went to bed that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every financial conversation we'd ever had. Every reassurance. Every "don't worry about it." A cold realization settled in. This wasn't just a bad investment. This was something hidden, something deliberate. I didn't confront her again the next day, or the day after that. Instead, I chose silence. Not because I was weak, but because I understood something important in that moment. If the truth had been buried for this long, rushing toward it would only push it deeper. Whatever had happened with our money wasn't accidental. And if I wanted answers, I needed to be patient. So I watched. I listened. And I started paying attention to details I had ignored for years. That's when I realized the real loss wasn't just our savings. It was the trust one had given freely, and the fact that someone I built my life with was willing to let me carry the blame for their choices. And I knew then, I had to be very careful about what I did next. Silence changed the way I moved through my own home. I stopped asking questions. I stopped reacting. Instead, I listened. I noticed when Laura took her phone into the bathroom and stayed there longer than necessary. I noticed how quickly browser tabs disappeared when I entered the room. I noticed that mail stopped arriving at the house, replaced by paperless statements and passwords I didn't know. At work, I found it harder to focus. Numbers that once felt predictable now carried weight. Every decision I made during the day reminded me that the one place I thought was stable, my marriage, had become uncertain. The first red flag came quietly. One evening, Laura mentioned an advisor she'd been consulting. She spoke about him casually, almost rehearsed, like someone repeating a line they practiced. She said he helped her navigate opportunities and minimize losses. The language felt off, vague, professional sounding, but empty. When I asked for a name, she shrugged. It's not important, she said. You wouldn't understand anyway. That sentence stayed with me. I requested access to our shared accounts the next day under the excuse of updating insurance documents. She hesitated before agreeing, then insisted on sitting beside me while I logged in. The balances were fragmented. Accounts I didn't recognize. Transfers labeled as consulting fees. Withdrawals spaced just far enough apart to avoid notice. Still, no smoking gun, so I slowed down even more. I pulled old statements from archived emails. I created a spreadsheet at work and stayed late to cross-reference dates. Patterns began to emerge. The savings hadn't disappeared overnight. They had bled out steadily, small, consistent amounts that added up to everything we'd built. Then came the second red flag. Laura started mentioning future plans that required money we clearly no longer had. Renovations, a possible move, even retirement talk. It wasn't denial, it was performance. She needed me to believe the illusion, so I wouldn't look behind it. The turning point came through an unexpected source. An old colleague from my logistics days reached out after noticing my name on a professional forum. We met for coffee. Casual conversation turned serious when he mentioned switching careers after uncovering fraud at his previous firm. Most people don't lose money in one bad decision, he said. They lose it by trusting the wrong person too long. That line felt like a warning meant just for me. I asked him, hypothetically, what he'd do if he suspected financial deception within a marriage. He didn't hesitate. Document everything, he said, quietly, and don't tip your hand. That night, I started building a record. Screenshots, downloaded statements, time-stamped notes. I backed everything up to a cloud account Laura didn't know existed. I stopped using our home computer and worked from my phone or office laptop instead. The third red flag came with a name. While sorting through archive statements, I found repeated transfers to the same external account. The recipient wasn't a firm. It was an individual, a man named Evan Marshall. I didn't confront Laura. I searched. Evan wasn't a licensed advisor. He wasn't registered anywhere. What he was, according to public records, was someone who had bounced between short-term ventures and legal disputes. Failed startups, personal loans, civil claims quietly settled. And there was something else. Photos, not inappropriate, not explicit, just familiar. Laura and Evan together at events she claimed were work-related. Standing too close, smiling too easily. That was when the betrayal became clear, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. The money hadn't just been lost. It had been entrusted to someone who never should have had access to it. I felt anger, yes. But more than that, I felt clarity. This wasn't about confronting her in the kitchen or demanding explanations that would dissolve into excuses. If Laura believed I was unaware, she would continue making mistakes. And those mistakes would become my leverage. So I made my first move. I scheduled a meeting with a financial counselor, alone. I presented the data neutrally, without emotion. He confirmed what I already knew. The funds had been misrepresented, misused, and potentially obtained under false pretenses. There's a legal angle here, he said carefully. But timing matters. I thanked him and left. At home, I became cooperative, supportive. I nodded during conversations. I agreed when Laura talked about recovering losses and turning things around. I even apologized once for not being more involved. That apology did something interesting. It made her careless. She stopped hiding as carefully. She made transfers more openly. She spoke more freely around me, assuming I'd accepted the blame. The night she admitted, offhandedly, that Evan was helping her personally was the moment I knew I had enough. I didn't argue. I waited. A week later, I contacted an attorney recommended by my colleague. I brought documentation. I explained calmly. No accusations. No dramatics. Just facts. He leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly. You did the right thing by waiting, he said. Now you let the system do the talking. My final move wasn't loud. I changed nothing at home, but I quietly separated my income, updated beneficiaries, froze any accounts that required dual authorization. Everything was done legally, transparently. Laura noticed the shift days later. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Just being responsible," I replied. That was the first time she looked uncertain. She didn't yet know that the illusion she'd worked so hard to maintain was already unraveling, that the proof was secured, that the story she told herself and me was about to meet something stronger than emotion. It was about to meet reality. And when it did, there would be no one left to blame. The truth has a way of changing the temperature in a room. It didn't explode into our lives all at once. It arrived slowly, through official envelopes, scheduled calls, and carefully worded questions that Laura could no longer deflect. The first letter came from the bank, then another from a regulatory office requesting clarification on several transactions. Each one chipped away at the confidence she had worn so comfortably for months. At first, she tried to keep the performance alive. She told me it was routine, that these things happen when investments got complicated, that I was overthinking it. But her voice lacked the certainty it once had. The irritation was still there, but underneath, it was something new: fear. When the attorney formally notified her that the accounts were under review, the story finally cracked. She didn't sit down to explain. She didn't apologize. She accused. She told me I had embarrassed her, that I had gone behind her back, that if I had trusted her, none of this would have escalated. For a moment, I almost believed her again. Old habits don't disappear easily, but the documents didn't lie. The funds had been transferred without disclosure. The risks had been misrepresented. Evan, her so-called advisor, had received large sums directly, with no legal authority to manage them. Some of the money had gone toward ventures that never existed. Some of it was simply gone. When confronted with those facts, Laura went quiet. The following weeks were heavy, but strangely calm. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic exits, just a slow separation of lives that had already been divided long before the truth came out. Friends began asking questions. Family members noticed the distance. Laura tried to control the narrative, but inconsistencies caught up with her. Stories changed. Timelines shifted. Eventually, the version of events she wanted people to believe became too fragile to stand on its own. The system moved at its own pace. Investigations don't care about intentions or emotions. They care about records, signatures, authorization, patterns. And the patterns were clear. Evan disappeared from her life almost immediately once the scrutiny began. No more late-night calls. No reassuring messages. Just silence. The person she had trusted with everything vanished the moment accountability appeared. That silence said more than any confession could. The financial consequences were real. Some of the money was recovered. Some wasn't. There were penalties, legal fees, long-term implications that would take years to fully settle. The life we had planned, retirement timelines, travel ideas, a sense of security, was gone. But something else replaced it: clarity. I leaned on people I hadn't realized I'd pushed away over the years. Colleagues who had seen similar situations. Friends who reminded me that responsibility doesn't mean control, and trust doesn't mean blindness. Even my parents, older and quieter now, offered perspective instead of judgment. "You did what you could with the information you had," my father said one evening. "What matters is what you did when you finally saw clearly." There was a formal separation, then a divorce. It wasn't quick and it wasn't painless, but it was honest. For the first time in a long while, there were no performances. Just paperwork, decisions, and consequences. Justice didn't come in the form of revenge. It came in accountability. Laura was required to face what she had done, not just financially, but emotionally. She couldn't shift the blame anymore. Not onto markets, not onto me, not onto circumstance. The narrative she had built collapsed under the weight of evidence. As for me, I rebuilt slowly. I downsized, simplified, relearned what security actually means. I became more involved in my finances, not out of fear, but out of respect for my future self. I asked questions. I verified. I stopped assuming that silence meant stability. Time did what it always does. It softened the sharpest edges. Years later, the loss still mattered, but it no longer defined me. What defined me was the decision I made early on, to stay calm, to observe, and to let truth carry the weight instead of anger. There are a few lessons I carry with me now. First, trust is not a substitute for transparency. In any partnership, personal or financial, shared responsibility matters. Second, silence can be strategic. Not every truth needs an immediate reaction. Sometimes patience reveals more than confrontation ever could. Third, accountability protects everyone. The moment someone resists it, you should pay attention. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if a detail doesn't sit right, or a question keeps returning, don't ignore it. You don't need to panic. You don't need to accuse. You just need to observe, document, and protect yourself calmly. Life has a way of testing us when we least expect it. What matters is not how quickly we react, but how wisely we respond. And if you've ever had to rebuild after trust was broken, know this: you're not alone, and clarity is stronger than blame. If this story made you reflect on your own experiences, feel free to share your thoughts. Sometimes, hearing how others navigated difficult truths helps us understand our own a little better. That's how healing begins, quietly, honestly, and one clear step at a time.